Hello, everyone! Welcome and welcome back. My name's Dan the Video Ninja. You guys all know who I am. And we are back once again for more gaming stuff. Big round of applause, everybody, for Manpans talking up a storm about blueprints in the previous panel. That was a deluge of really awesome geeky stuff that I am here for. But this, as you all know, as it says right down there in my little bar there, is my indie. There's an indie for that panel. This is kind of a tradition now, every single year and whatnot. I submitted this panel late last year, actually, and I got a shocked response back from the Kanji staff, who were surprised that we've made it 6 years doing this virtual convention, and as told by the fact that I've been doing this panel every single year for the last 6 years. So that's quite something to be proud of, I must say. So, round of applause for all of you guys for keeping us going there and keeping us alive and keeping things going. So, may it lead to 6,000 more. Absolutely. I will be doing this convention till we're 90. So, for the 6th time, here's what we're doing. I am a huge video game nerd. Not surprising, I'm sure. We all know a lot of them in our circles. Most of us have played games to one degree or another, and that's probably some of you watching right now. Hey, thank you for the donation. Some of you watching right now might be even bigger gaming nerds than I am. I doubt it, but so we all play games, you know. Some of us play maybe 1 or 2 games a lot. How many hours do we all have chalked up in things like Stardew Valley or Final Fantasy XIV, am I right? And some of us try the best that we can to play all kinds of games. I'm more in that latter category, really, and I've been doing this whole gaming thing my entire life, so I've seen it all and then some. And sometimes when you play enough games, you can't help but notice history kind of repeating itself over time here. What I mean by that is there's a lot of games that keep coming out year after year that remind us of games that we might have played before, in the long, long ago, during simpler times. Well, that idea is kind of where we're planting our flag for the next hour or so. We're going to look at some new games and that remind us of some old games. And it's pretty much simple as that. If there's a particular gaming experience that all of you happen to have in your core memories or whatever, well, say it with me now. There's an indie for that. Fun fact, an earlier draft of the script that I'm reading off of right now for this panel actually involved me talking about blueprints. But I feel like that's kind of been covered, so I think we're just going to move on and, stick to what I came up with instead on the list here. So we're going to be talking about classic old games here, and then we're going to have some look at some new indie games that are kind of compared to them. If there's some nostalgic excitement about some of the old games, great. I'd love to see it in the chat. If there's some fresh new excitement about some of the newer games, also great. And if you see something in all the lists, whether it's the new games or the old games, that just make you think to yourself, that looks like fun. I might want to try that. Well, that's the best great that we can hope for, isn't it? Maybe have those gaming wish lists ready to go just in case. Now, some housekeeping. I did this spiel last year as well, and I'm going to do it again. In fact, I pretty much copy and pasted this spiel entirely from my script last year. But I've got some gameplay footage to show you guys because, what better way for me to demonstrate how cool these games are than for me to show them to you. But some of the gameplay footage might have flashing lights in it. So everybody just be aware of that and try to be comfortable and excuse yourself if it gets a bit much for you. Also, 1 or 2 of the games that I have on the list here might be brushing up against the edge of the PG-13 rating that we kind of aim for here in Kanji. Not so much in terms of visceral graphic stuff or whatever. There's no Mortal Kombat stuff here or anything in here like that. But I'll say that 1 or 2 of the games on the list may not be aimed at younger audiences, let's say. So if you happen to have younger people or younger audiences watching, just be ready to provide some context. Viewer discretion is advised, let's say. So enough of that fun stuff. Let's get into the fun stuff. First of all, let's kick things off with the first half of the first entry that I have here. And as always, we start things off with a Who Remembers member berry, and then we move on to the There's an Indie for That side of things. So, who remembers Mega Man X? Even if you've never played this game, you know about this one. Whether you came across this game earnestly in the 90s or more likely through the Ego Raptor memes and such, chances are you're familiar with the legacy that this second run of jump and shoot action games established with its first Super Nintendo outing. Mega Man X took the 2D platforming bedrock established in the classic Mega Man games on the NES and gave it a 16-bit glow-up and made it faster, punchier, and more explosive than anything we'd seen the Blue Bomber involved in up until now. Whereas classic Mega Man games had sort of an 80s cartoon approach to their design, with the main character being more childlike, as it was sort of harkening back to its inspirations, to stuff like Astro Boy, for example. And, you know, the bad guys were like these outlandish, super villainish cartoon characters or whatever. The Mega Man X series, on the other hand, aimed to crib a little bit more from the then very popular 90s anime scene by including things like, you know, the mysterious rival, the badass sidekick, you know, the sidekick character Zero, and, you know, the villain being a much more menacing, like, super villain with all of the anime tropes, like a laser sword and a big mech that he had in his final form and so on. But besides all that, what made the Mega Man X series a true elevation was how it added so much more action gameplay into the mix. It's been talked about again and again, but since the game came out years ago, but it can't be overstated what a big deal all the new traversal mechanics in the game were, like wall jumping, for example, or even just dashing. It made all the level designs a little bit more intricate, and they made them more interesting than just, you know, straight lines that you just followed along until you got to like a square room with a boss in it. Some of the levels were like vertical. Some of the levels had vehicles that you could ride, like mechs or mine carts or speed bikes or whatever. And some of the bosses weren't waiting in a little box room. Maybe they were on a crashing airship or something. So the stage was set for more grandiose set pieces and fast-paced jump-and-shoot action as Mega Man X and his new cast of friends and foes burst onto the scene. It had taken what they had learned in the success of the Mega Man series and reestablished it and made the 2D jump-and-shoot platforming genre one of the most fundamental gaming genres there was of the time. And there's an indie for that, if you could believe it. This is 30XX. This is probably one of the best examples of taking a classic gaming blueprint and injecting it with an additional 30 years of game design theory. 30XX is what happens when folks my age, who were raised on games like Mega Man X, grow up and get their hands on development tools. A lot of people don't, or a lot of people seem to forget this, but the Super Nintendo classics that we all remember, like the Mega Man X series, Castlevania, Contra, all the big action games, they weren't long games. Most of them you could finish, you know, in one evening, or even just a few hours if you actually knew what you were doing. They were designed that way mostly due to technological restraints. You know, there was only so much space you could fit on those cartridges back in the day. But what if you took that restriction away? What if you could do what 30XX here is doing and turn the entire game into a roguelike, where every stage is different and procedurally generated, and there's a heck of a lot more of them? What if you could stuff even more beautiful pixel art and lovely chiptune music into the game? What if you could make it two-player, but like, you know, not hot seat two-player like what we were stuck with back in the day, like two-player co-op at the same time? You can do that in this game. You don't even need to be in the same room with the person that you're playing with. You know, it's the future. We can do that now. So that's the spirit of 30XX. It's all the jump, shoot, dash, slash action that you remember, polished and powered all the way up. You still fight bosses and you take their weapons. You still dodge pits. You still dodge spikes. It's all here. And it's all unashamedly ready to embrace everyone who remembers powering up the Mega Buster. Did not know about this one. That's what I'm counting on. Definitely check it out. And if you've got a friend along for the ride, it plays buttery smooth if you've got a second player to play along with you. Moving on. Who remembers Rhythm Heaven? Considered by most to be one of the pioneers of the rhythm game genre, you know, at least one of the ones that wasn't controlled by like a plastic guitar or those four-arrowed dance pads that we remember from the arcades. Rhythm Heaven is a catchy little match-the-beat touchscreen handheld game from the mid-2000s. It was so catchy, in fact, that it has had a steady stream of sequels released ever since its initial release, with its latest installment actually due out later this year. Rhythm Heaven made use of the handheld touchscreen consoles like the Nintendo DS, for example. With simple visual cues and wacky animations, the game was very easy to pick up and understand while offering a generous difficulty curve and a lot of peppy music to guide the player along. They had to tap, swipe, shake, and do all kinds of other such actions in tune with the beat of the song to keep their score going, and at the end of each stage, you got a rating based on how well you did. But what made the series so endearing was just how peppy and catchy that those songs were, and how addictive the challenge of matching to each song was as it sped up and got more intense. It was easy for the first couple of bars in each song to follow along with the notes and actions, but before long, things would start to really gain speed, and the player really had to keep up, and it was always fun and exciting. Rhythm Heaven and similar collections of micro games like what the WarioWare series became. They're all like these niche little pocket of quirky games that are fun to sort of fiddle around with and groove along to, you know? They don't have huge ideas or epic sweeping production values. What you see is kind of what you get. They're just fun little timing challenges, you know? They're perfect for like maybe a long bus ride or a lunch break, for example. It's very satisfying to get good at. I can imagine, yeah. And there's an indie for that. This is Melatonin, and for this one, we're bringing it down just a bit. This has the same rhythm gameplay that every other rhythm game has had, but it's a little more chill, a little more relaxed until it isn't, with a more specific color palette too, and more of a dreamlike aesthetic, which, you know, one would expect from a game named Melatonin. But that's exactly actually the framing device that this handful of colorful, surreal rhythm levels wraps itself in. Slipping back and forth between wakeful modernity and sleepy dreamscapes, Melatonin is a game about finding a groove in some vibrant little lo-fi beats and performing fun, bizarre actions along to it. Sometimes you might be zapping aliens with a spaceship. Other times you might be trying to chomp little bits of pizza or donuts as they're being tossed to you from portals in the sky. The game follows suit with all like-minded rhythm games by providing an easy-to-understand instructions at the beginning of each level and a little tutorial space for you to sort of get your footing before it just sort of lets you go loose, and afterwards you're left to just try and achieve the highest possible score you can amidst the gorgeous hand-drawn animation and dream worlds where giant cell phones act as platforms and coins fall from the sky from giant piggy banks. Melatonin is exactly the kind of game for anybody who's ever fallen asleep in front of their screens late at night and dreamed about lifting weights or swiping credit cards to the beat of whatever song is still playing in your headphones as you're kind of nodding off, you know? It captures a wonderfully playful pastel sense of soothing, almost meditative calm that I think we could all use a lot more of in our chaotic, noisy lives. Oh my god, thank you for this. I've had this on my wish list forever, and I almost forgot about it. Well, now you won't forget about it, will you? I'm glad to hear about that, and you're very welcome. The vibes are on lock. You are right, for sure. Moving on. Let's take a trip back, shall we? Who remembers Marble Madness? Here's one right out of the arcades. Those mythical realms you all heard from all the legends that us older gamers never seem to stop talking about. These were the places where controllers weren't always buttons and sticks. Sometimes they were balls. And sometimes those balls could control other balls, like marbles. Marble Madness was one of the first or second generation video games that was all premise and mechanics and virtually nothing else. You were tasked in a game like this with rolling a glass marble down an increasingly complex lands of 3D geometry without slipping too far off an edge anywhere and shattering your poor marble to pieces. In its initial state, this was achieved using an ancient relic of gaming controller technology known as the trackball, which was just a ball that was embedded in the arcade machine that you could roll around with your hand to sort of simulate rolling a marble in the game. It was kind of trippy. Eventually, this game got ported to every other console that was available at the time, since it was a big hit. And thus, what we had to then learn was how to manage the same kind of controller scheme, but with a directional pad on home consoles. It was tough. Novel, though. And that's kind of what Marble Madness really boiled down to. A novel little glimpse into the 3D worlds that video games would eventually evolve into in the decades to come. All while offering a fun little challenge in the form of never-before-seen control schemes and movement mechanics for us all to really kind of master as we pump quarter after quarter into those arcade machines. And there's an indie for this one. This is Venenith. I can never remember how to pronounce the name of this game properly. Venenith. And this could likely be the best example of a direct, straight-line evolution of one specific gaming IP. Venenith is about as alien to most modern gamers as Marble Madness must have been to our predecessors. Except instead of simulating a 3D space, now you're rolling a ball around in 3D and in space. And alien really is the right word to describe this game, too, because what you can all glean from the footage that I'm running on the screen right there, beyond that, there really isn't a story or a plot going on in this game. We're once again just fully immersed in the realm of premise and mechanics here. All you can really do is just roll around, and there's a jump button, a little jump button. This is not Mario. The big difference, though, in this game is that there's a lot more for you to see and explore than just a low-poly hill full of bumps and holes in it. Venenith sends you across the entire cosmos to multiple planets, stars, and other celestial areas. Don't bother asking why. This isn't that kind of game. Just pick a cool-looking planet and try to get from one side of it to another. But you aren't just trying to master the traversal mechanisms in this one, though. With alien planets comes alien puzzles that might require you to hunt for alien switches, or alien portals that will activate alien devices or open alien doors. It's all very non-terrestrial, but that's kind of the charm of the game. You'll always have something unique to check out as you roll through these massive stages. If you're looking for new worlds to explore without any hand-holding at all, and you can groove on the idea of doing so as basically a giant sentient ball of iron, Venenith is unlike anything that you've probably ever seen or played before. I was expecting you to say something like Monkey Ball. Monkey Ball's not a bad analogy as well. Yeah, for sure. I just want to watch this game. It is, yeah, find some playthroughs online if maybe controlling it is not your thing, because it's just beautiful to look at, too. Moving on. Who remembers... Oh, boy, we're going back here again. Okay, who remembers Silent Hill? Frankly, at this point, even the tiniest of tiny gamers have heard of us all bang on and on about this one. Foundational horror series, best horror game ever, we say over and over again. And while that is all completely true and irrefutable, that doesn't stop us from referencing it nonstop. Nor does it stop some of us from putting it on a series of lists of video games year after year. To bring this particular sermon of praise for this venerated survival horror series back into a bit more focus, one aspect that I think was very much solidified during the era of horror gaming that Silent Hill came from was the concept of what I like to call the horror dungeon. These were sections of a game like Resident Evil or Silent Hill that centered around one large, sprawling puzzle box area that involved a lot of key hunting and puzzle solving, along with, dodging all the spooky stuff. So think the Spencer Mansion, Brookhaven Hospital from Silent Hill, the RPD from Resident Evil 2. These were all essentially the dungeons we remember from earlier adventure games like The Legend of Zelda, for example. It was just gorier and, a little bit more disturbing. There was often one critical path that winded its way through all of these labyrinths, and everything besides that critical path was either a dead end or a locked door. So when you weren't immediately worried about getting your face bitten off or your ankles slashed, you had to keep checking your map and hunting for whatever key or key let you get further down that critical path. I think this is what gave some of the early survival horror games their edge when they first showed up. They were able to onboard a lot of us gamers who had already spent years and years diving in and out of dungeons and mazes in places like Hyrule or the worlds of Metroid, for example. But they had this added spice of Halloween monsters and spooky imagery to hook some of us in. And there's so many indies for this one, like I say often, but I got a good one for this one. Along comes the 2020s, the current decade, right? And the current decade's obsession with all retro throwback horror games looking like PS1 era games. Like, it's kind of like the pixel art boom of the last decade. You remember in the 2010s where every indie game had to try and look like it was on an NES because it was all pixel art? Well, everything coming out now in the horror indie game section of gaming is trying to look like Silent Hill. It's all got that same look to it. It's got the low poly count in the models. It's got that grainy, dithering filter all over everything. They even come with a lot of settings in their settings to turn that off if it doesn't suit you, but it's all there. So it's all there. And a late homework here, which is an example of one of the best recent iterations of that idea, is something that really captures that PlayStation 1 horror gaming lightning in a bottle, I think. So the premise of this game is you play as a young student named Hanako, who is worried about her homework that she left at school. She's so worried about it, in fact, that she decides to return to the school late at night to try and retrieve her homework. But, as we all know, you never go back to a public school after dark. That's when the monsters come out. And in the case of Hanako's school, one really big hallway monster roaming around that you can't do anything about but run from. So this game is only maybe like a 1 or 2 hour experience, but it captures that essence of the horror dungeon that I was talking about perfectly. When you're in the hallways, you have to keep an eye out for the monster and watch out for anything that might be lurking around the corners, and you have to keep an eye on your stamina. There's no shooting in this game. There's no combat at all. All you can do is run. And when you're in the classrooms or when you're in the other passageways off from the main hallway or whatever, you're doing the horror dungeon thing. You're looking for keys, you're solving puzzles. Maybe you're getting a little spook here and there if you're playing around with a ghost or whatever, but it's that PlayStation 1 era of horror gaming recreated perfectly. Even the map is pretty much just copied wholesale from Silent Hill. If it pops up on screen here again, you'll see it's the same exact design, same color palette, same markings. There it is right there, right out of Silent Hill. If Halloween season rolls around again this year and some of you out there are looking for something that's maybe not another bombastic zombie shooter or first-person hide and stealth game, and instead are looking for the kind of scares that you maybe remember from 20 years ago, late homework here will scratch that precise, specific itch that you seem to have. Love the dithering, low-poly aesthetic. Yeah, you and everybody else that's making these kinds of games. Moving on. Oh boy. Okay, the next game might be what I had in mind when I mentioned at the beginning that maybe not aimed at a younger audience here. Don't worry, like I said, not too graphic, but if you know, you know. Who remembers I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream? Going back even further and possibly going even darker, this infamous mid-90s point-and-click adventure game was grim and gritty long before we even thought we knew what that term meant. It's based on Harlan Ellison's short story from the 1960s of the same name, and this post-apocalyptic sci-fi psychological horror game is not for the faint of heart. But that's what made it so compelling, especially in the 90s, you know? This wasn't King's Quest. This was so much worse. Oh, it played just like every other Sierra adventure game of the time. You know, you clicked around the screen to move your character, and you could talk and pick up and interact with anything that had a label. But you weren't battling wizards in a magical forest in this game. Oh no. Instead, what you were doing is you were piloting around 5 of the most unlucky humans left in a world controlled and nearly decimated by a psychotic, hateful AI program with nothing better to do for decades than torture the last remains of humanity. Aren't video games fun? The reason why everyone who does remember this game remembers it is the same reason that everybody else probably never gave it any thought. It really is an exploration into some very dark themes and subject matter, and it's presented in a medium that had not tried to approach this sort of material before. Stories about abuse, despair, hatefulness. There's been thousands of books written and hundreds of movies filmed about these ideas, but video games were still very young in this era, so nobody really saw this one coming. The result is a game that's certainly more memorable, if not, I'd say pleasant to experience. It's kind of become a bit of a relic of its time, really. It's known more for its legacy as one of the earliest truly mature games, more so than any lasting appeal of the surface text of what's going on in the story in the game. Despair and hope? I don't know. Hope might be in short supply in a game like this. And if you can believe it, I'm the kind of guy that goes out looking for indies that remind us of games like this. And if you can even believe it further, I found one. This is If on a Winter's Night for Travelers. Now, besides the title being a little bit just as much as of a mouthful as the last game, this tiny, free anthology adventure game is following a lot of the same footsteps as I Have No Mouth, etc., etc. Point-and-click adventure gameplay, detailed sprite work, and pitch black tone when it comes to the themes and narrative. The game's framing device is set on a decadent train that's traveling through the afterlife, whereon we meet the titular 4 travelers, one by one, and learn how they came to be on that train. Their stories twist in and out of several historical periods and settings, and center around, once again, some lovely concepts like abuse, addiction, self-harm, trauma, degradation, occultism, the horrors of war. Great stuff. But make no mistake, the game is sharply written, though, and it pulls no punches as it uses these dark stories to explore the limits of the human condition. So this is a smaller, more linear experience as compared to some of the adventure games of the time, even compared to I Have No Mouth, etc. Since there's not a lot of inventory management in a game like this, you can kind of think of this game as more like a midnight screening of some experimental horror film at a film festival, rather than, you know, like a nightmare-themed escape room that you have to puzzle solve your way out of. This game doesn't really have any fail states. You won't see any game over screens really that much in this one. Although it could be argued, I suppose, that just proceeding through the game and its macabre stories might fill the role of a fail state in terms of emotional response from the player. If you've got the stomach for some fiercely well-written, chilling tales about the darker side of the human experience, you can snatch up this game for free on Steam and give it a try. It's not very long. You can probably finish it in an hour or two, but it is a concentrated hit of haunting video game narrative to experience. I Have No Mouth is just, yeah, for sure. It's like a science fiction double feature, yeah. And I'm not even kidding. Like, I had to be very careful about the clips that I picked to show you guys here, because from what you're seeing on the screen here, you might be believing, oh, it's just some macabre stories. No, there's some dark stuff in here that I couldn't even bring myself to show you guys. Get the game, try it out yourself if you dare. Just be warned that it is tough. There are some very dark scenes. Some members of my stream watched me stream it, and it was compelling, like I said, but pretty rough. Doing a bad job selling it, but I think it was good. Anyway, let's get away from some of that and move on to something a little bit not this. Who remembers Rogue? From older games with stories we hadn't seen before to even older games with gameplay we hadn't seen before, here comes Rogue from the early 1980s. This is the great granddaddy of all procedurally generated dungeon crawlers. This is a game that inspired an entire genre. There's a reason why they are called roguelikes. Rogue took the dungeon crawling elements of early Dungeons & Dragon modules and stripped it down to its bare bones. There's no towns or NPCs to deal with. There's no skill checks for stealth or charisma or any of that fancy stuff that all the kids do at their table these days. No, there's just 1,000 doors to kick down, 1,000 monsters to slay, and 1,000 piles of loot to pick up. It's not much to look at, I'll give you that. But, this was quite a long time ago. Theater of the Mind worked for everyone back when the first wave of TTRPGs came out, so, why not here? All the things that you needed to know were up there on the screen for you. It showed you where you were, what your stats were, and where the doors were. That's all you needed. Such a bare-bones setup was what it took to give this game the freedom to kind of conjure up endless dungeon configurations and monster encounters. So it was like getting a fresh DM every single time you sat down to play. For those with an active enough imagination, this was hundreds of hours of fantasy adventures, all stuffed into a program that was probably not any larger than the last spreadsheet that we all worked on. Rogue may not electrify the senses of anyone that goes back to give it an earnest play today, but it remains an important footnote in the pages of video gaming history. And there's quite a few indies for this one. But I got kind of a curveball for this one. You might be thinking, as I was talking about Rogue there, that my indie pick would be some recent game that takes the skeleton of gameplay and layers on some slick, next-generation graphics on top of it. Well, you're right, sort of. This is House of Necrosis, and at first glance, most of you are probably now thinking to yourselves, Dan, you mixed up your clips. Clearly, this is meant to be another game trying to look like one of your PlayStation 1 horror games, like Resident Evil, right? Well, you're right again about that, sort of. See, what we have here is something a little unprecedented for the indie list this year, because this game is trying to play like a classic that you all remember, but it's also trying to look like a different classic that you might all remember. Did I lose anybody? Okay, simply put, House of Necrosis here is a game that looks like Resident Evil 1, but it plays like Rogue. It's procedurally generated hallways that lead to procedurally generated rooms full of procedurally generated monsters and traps and treasures. Okay, that's Rogue, right? We can all agree that's Rogue. But everything looking like a launch title for the first PlayStation console, complete with low-poly characters, grainy alias textures, and a hub area that is literally just a grand staircase with a few inventory boxes. Well, we all know what that's supposed to be, don't we? Turning classic foundational survival horror franchises into RNG dungeon crawls is probably not it's probably not something that you'd ever see come from like one of the big studios or big publishers, is it? But that's why we play indie games, Where else are you going to find a game starring not Jill Valentine running around in straight lines and turning on 90-degree angles, casting Final Fantasy VII spells and blasting mutant plants and not tyrants with an arsenal all loaded up with Diablo stats? Indie gaming, that's where. Did I really just write that ridiculous sentence? My goodness. Final Fantasy VII, Jill Valentine. You got it. The live action still on the grid framework reminds me a bit of Crypt of the Necrodancer. Yeah, Crypt of the Necrodancer, though, was also a rhythm game, though. This one is more turn-based than rhythm. Whereas, nothing in this game happens until you do something, but you don't have to do it on the beat, at least, like you did in Necrodancer. So that would be the main differentiation I would make there. Moving right along, and oh my god, how far back are we going to go this year, Dan? Does anybody possibly remember Breakout? The original Breakout? A lot of really old ones on the list this year, huh? Like, I know we did Pong a few years back, and it doesn't get much older than that, but this one here might as well be a single step younger, because most of our parents were kids when this arcade classic started showing up. Pretty much just plays exactly like Pong as well, except you didn't need a second player to play this one, and instead you could just spend hours trying to chip away at an entire wall, brick by carefully bouncing a tiny little dot back and forth up and down the screen. Eventually, the iterations that came years later of this game, some of which you might know by its more popular name, Arkanoid, they spiced up the gameplay a little bit more by giving you power-ups and whatnot to change the gameplay up a little bit. But in the beginning, it was just this, wall after wall, brick after brick, just back and forth, back and forth. But it worked. Like so many early video games, its simplicity was its strength. This was one of those gaming experiences that offered easy access to that Zen-like mindset of focusing solely on the task at hand and allowing the rest of the universe to just sort of wash away behind you, In such a state, I have to wonder how many young gamers were free to let their imagination just sort of fill in the blanks on where these blocks came from, who put them there, why were we destroying them, what would happen if we failed to clear these blocks away. Chances are a lot more imaginative gamers than me were able to come up with some very creative answers to all of those questions. And they might have even made it into an indie game, if you can believe it. So, what if it wasn't just colored blocks? What if they were monsters? And you were battling armies of them, wave after wave, constantly marching towards you. Does that not sound like exactly the kind of scenario a wandering gamer mind would come up with as they tried again and again to bounce a ball up and down a screen? This is Ball Pit, in which you set out with a squad of heroes to tackle hordes of monsters with the power of chaos theory. The developers of this game tapped into the idea that Breakout really became a lot more fun and engaging to players when the power-ups started showing up. So they built their entire indie game around the idea of power-ups. Now you have your little balls are not just little dots or whatever. Now you have balls that can freeze, balls that can explode, balls that shoot lasers. They can poison the enemies, pierce armor, do just about anything. It's a lot more exciting now. And it's also virtually impossible to describe this game without someone in the chat probably giggling to themselves. Balls that explode, indeed. When you aren't facing down the legion of monsters in this game with your balls, there's also a base building aspect to this game, kind of like ActRaiser a little bit, except not really. It's not exactly that, or it's not exactly SimCity either. You can plop down your little buildings wherever you want, but in order to develop them, you have to send out a construction crew that, for some reason in this game, always follow along a chaos theory path as well. So you kind of have to bounce the citizens of your city around the town so that they can build it up. I don't know why. It's construction crew via chaos theory patterns, bouncing off walls, and only developing structures that they happen to collide with because... I don't know, with such a quirky system of meta progression as well as a fun one more run core gameplay loop that also borrows a little bit from other indie games, like anybody who's played stuff like Vampire Survivors or other bullet hell type games, or bullet heaven type games rather, where you're all constantly getting power-ups run after run. They'll probably find some similarities in a game like this. Ball Pit shows that games have come a long way from simply bouncing dots and breaking bricks. Now they have balls. Lots of them. Have we got a running count about the number of times throughout this entire panel I've said the word balls? Somebody might have to run the tape back and get a count for us. It's got to be at least a dozen. At least. Moving on. Who remembers Portal 2? Okay, yeah, obviously everybody remembers this because it was an amazing sequel. But I have a bit of a curveball for this one because we're talking specifically about the two-player co-op mode of Portal 2, where players take control of a pair of adorable bumbling robots and pilot them through dozens of test chambers set up by Gladys in the wake of her decision to step away from live test subjects. Though it was often overshadowed by the single-player mode, Portal 2's co-op mode was one of the first examples of asynchronous multiplayer co-op puzzle solving that somehow managed to be even more mind-bending than trying to get through just, the core game itself. Now the emphasis wasn't just on figuring out how to think with portals. You had to try and use two brains to think and try to think with twice as many portals. So it took good communication skills in order to successfully convey information and instructions to your partner in this game, which made for a far more entertaining experience, when you weren't trolling each other and trying to get each other bashed to pieces. One player might have to guide the other through a gauntlet of traps that they couldn't see, or both players might need to, time their efforts and synchronize what they're doing and coordinate their portal positions in order to avoid disaster and get through these rooms. There was nothing that made you and a friend feel more, we'll say, drift compatible than putting your heads together and surviving long enough to outsmart a deranged homicidal AI computer. And that's the kind of victory that the cooperative mode in Portal 2 would serve up again and again. Never found someone to do the multiplayer with. Well, maybe if you put the call out in the Kanji Discord, some other wayward soul might join along with you. Maybe Poke Man Pants. She loves this game. And I got an indie for this one too, and it's an extensive one. This is We Were Here. Now we're stepping away from the test chambers and into a whole fantasy adventure about two explorers searching through magical caverns and castles and ruins. The We Were Here series, there's a few titles in the entire franchise, but they all play pretty much the same. Expands upon the idea of asymmetrical puzzle gameplay in a very big way. See, in a game like Portal, you and your partner may be on the opposite sides of a room separated by glass or a force field or whatever, but you were still trying to solve the exact same puzzle using the exact same set of tools, or rather, a single tool that did the same thing. In an adventure game like We Were Here, though, you and your partner will often be in completely different rooms with completely different sets of puzzles and information presented to each player. One player might be in a room, say, filled with a bunch of switches and dials with weird glowing symbols on them that they just cannot parse for any reason. And the other player might be like in a library where they're able to look up what each symbol means, for example. So your communication skills matter more than ever in a game like this, because now you have to describe to your partner, stuff like where you are, what's happening, and the two of you have to decide and agree on what needs to be done in order to be able to reunite each other so that you can continue on with your adventure. So if you truly feel like you are one half of an amazing puzzle-solving duo who share the same brain cells and can take on even the most challenging of puzzle hunts or escape rooms, the We Were Here franchise will provide endless chances for you to test your puzzle-solving might and communication skills. It's pretty cool that the players get separated that much. I would say you spend less than 5% of these games in the same space as your partner. Like, you're very obviously separated by walls or obstacles or whatever. So you're very much always separated from your partner. There's a reason why you spend the entire game with a walkie-talkie to your face. And if this looks like something that sparks anybody's interest, the first game in the series is just called We Were Here. I believe it's actually free on Steam for you to try, so you can give it a shot. It's the first game that they ever made, though. It's like their prototype game, though, so it's not the most polished one, but it is free if you want to get a sense of what the gameplay is like. And if it gets its hooks into you, then you might be interested in the later games that came from the series. Okay, a little bit of water, because we ain't done yet, guys. We got a few more. Ready? I know everybody was going to remember this next one. Who remembers Donkey Kong? There's no school like the old school, and one of video games' earliest champions was Nintendo's original tales of a portly little mustached man jumping, running, climbing, and trying to save his gal from a giant gorilla. That was the foundation upon which came countless iterations of this arcade classic, and one of the more direct descendants came on the Game Boy in the 90s. So we're talking specifically about the Game Boy version of Donkey Kong that came out in the 90s here, and it took the original arcade game's setup and expanded it to the length of an entire full adventure with several worlds filled with different levels for Mario to parkour his way through. Sure, you were still running, jumping, climbing, but now there were keys to find, there were doors to unlock, there were switches to press, there were machines to turn on and off. And there were even more foes to dodge your way around as you ascended each level on your way to another encounter with the Great Ape. Though he had new acrobatic tricks up his sleeve, Mario still had to carefully plan his route through each of these stages in order to avoid the hassles, including gravity, since this was one of those Mario games that had included fall damage for some reason. Certain barriers in these levels could only be crossed or broken through with certain items, but carrying items around could impede Mario's maneuverability, so it took dexterity and mastery of all the elements in each stage to make it through to the exit door, especially if you were an ambitious player and you were looking to also rack up extra lives by hunting down all the optional side bonuses scattered throughout the levels. Leave it to good old Mario and his oldest, hairiest rival to not only keep a classic franchise alive and kicking years after its initial launch, but to expand it in a way that made it feel more than just a fun little 2 or 3 minute arcade experience. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy was a smart, fun little adventure that made players feel quick and clever as they played through it. Gravity is a hassle. Got it. Yep. Things that we learned from video games, although that's one that I think maybe we should have learned a little earlier, but you never know. And I got a good indie for this one. Check this out. This here is The Pedestrian. Here's another adventure that will involve thinking your way around puzzly 2D mazes and mastering all kinds of switches, doors, keys, locks, and even the layouts of the levels themselves. No Mario this time, unfortunately. Sorry. Instead, you pilot Stickman. Look, he was called Jumpman before he was called Mario, remember? The Pedestrian presents an easy-to-understand gameplay concept with an abundant amount of style and flourish. At its core, you're just running and jumping and climbing again, but when the game zooms out and you also have to build the paths towards and around the different rooms that you need to navigate, that's when the game really sort of comes alive, you know? You might find yourself jumping in and out of and down and through street signs in one area, and then progressing through a series of workplace safety instruction posters in the next area. The world that you have to explore exists right within our very own world, hidden amongst street signs and direction plaques. It's really quite charming, and the way the camera sort of sweeps from scene to scene really gives the sense that we, as players, are kind of along for the ride with our little stick figure friend here. So it may not have a great big ape waiting to throw barrels at you at the end of each run, but the Pedestrian will task any puzzle enthusiast with hours of lateral thinking traversal puzzles. And if you're able to make it all the way to the final stretches of this game, well, I won't spoil anything, but there's a few surprises in the final moments of this game that I think a lot of gamers won't see coming. He's got a top hat. What's not to like? That is actually one of the aspects of the game, too. You can customize the stick figure in that you can put different hats on him. Pretty sure there's like a Super Saiyan spiky hairdo that you can put on him at some point as well. The true villain was man. Nick, why'd you have to spoil it, man? All right, moving on into the home stretch here, folks. Who remembers The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap? I saved all the Nintendo member berries for last, it seems, this year. We've touched on the Zelda adventures in this list a few times in the previous years, but here's one that's a little newer and, like many of Link's adventures, a little bit of a left turn in the franchise here. As so many of the games in this series do, Minish Cap delivers the classic Zelda recipe of dungeons and towns and magic items, boss fights, and so on. but with its own unique flavor in terms of graphic design and gameplay mechanics. The adorable titular Minish Cap acts as your chatty sidekick this time around, and also doubles as the game's main gimmick, giving Link the ability to shrink down to the size of a bug and explore a whole second world in the grass and bushes and under the feet and furniture of the larger world. This is what gave the game its identity, particularly within the context of the franchise itself. So much of the story this time around ties into the idea of having to using the shrinking ability to interact with a minuscule race of NPCs, and all the puzzles and traversal challenges in the game are specifically built around the different properties of normal-size Link and Minish-size Link. It's still very much a Zelda adventure. You know, Link is still as silent and heroic as ever. There's still an evil force to deal with that threatens the land, and Zelda's in there somewhere, I assume. I haven't actually played this one myself. But her being there is always important. I mean, it's her name on the box. But like a few other entries in the franchise, like Wind Waker or Majora's Mask, it's also unmistakably its own unique thing. Minish Cap is, that is. No other game in the franchise, or even in gaming in general, could be mistaken for the Minish Cap, I don't think. I for sure know this indie suggestion. Oh, do you now? Yeah. Probably saw it coming a mile away. But for those who aren't as on the ball, we got an indie for this one for sure. This is Pipistrello and the Cursed Yo-Yo. If there's one game on this year's indie list that I would hope all of you would jot down in your wish lists, I think this would be my pick. This is an entirely original IP that sings all the same songs that you've heard before, but with completely new instruments. We need more games like Pipistrello and the Cursed Yo-Yo, you know? It certainly looks like many of the Game Boy Advance games we remember from the past, and that's on purpose. The game even cheekily frames itself as like a lost Game Boy Advance game. Our main character in this game is Pipit, a young yo-yo champ who returns to visit his rich aunt one night, who happens to be sort of a Scrooge McDuck-like energy tycoon whose business essentially runs an entire city. But trouble stirs when you arrive, as several other colorful cartoon tycoons show up to stage a hostile takeover. Things go sideways real fast. Auntie's soul gets split into 5 pieces. Just go with it. One of them remains with you and actually inherits the soul of your yo-yo and acts as your Navi for the game. And the other 4 pieces end up as basically not Triforce pieces for you to venture out and collect throughout your adventure. So, armed with your fancy yo-yo tricks that are used in this game both for combat and for traversal puzzles, you've got an entire urban kingdom to explore, complete with, it still has though dungeons and shops and NPCs and side quests, all that stuff, but it's a bit of a departure from the green fields and magical caverns of Hyrule. But the grand city is not lacking for puzzles and traps and treasures. You won't find bombs, you won't find bows or boomerangs or anything like that, but you are a master yo-yo trickster after a while, and you'll pick up a new trick every now and then for your yo-yo that, of course, will open up different sections of what ends up being kind of a Metroidvania-style map in this game. So if you can't get enough of grand adventures and colorful characters, both good and evil, but are looking for more of an urban take on the formula, Pipistrello and the Cursed Yo-Yo is a fresh approach to that genre. Pipistrello's gameplay looks awesome. I was certain you were going to say Mina the Hollower. Ooh, yeah, that would be a close second. But I'd put Mina the Hollower as more of an analog to something like Link's Awakening. This one, though, screams Game Boy Advance, which is probably very much Minish Cap, I think. My goodness, we did it, guys. We got through the list yet again. Thank you to everybody for joining me. Hopefully you had fun remembering some older games and discovering some new ones. Thanks again, of course, to Kanji for giving me the opportunity to gush here about my indie games at this wonderful virtual convention. It's always a treat, and I hope to keep the discussion going throughout the weekend over on the video game channel of Kanji's official Discord. Hint, hint. So, if you haven't already joined that, be sure to get on that. There's a channel for there's other channels on there too for cosplay, gaming, all that kind of stuff. There's a silly memes channel. I mentioned all of this in the opening ceremonies, but I'm going to be hanging around in the video gaming channel for sure. And if you liked or want to chat me up about some of the stuff you saw on my list this year, or if you've got, you know, your own suggestions of analogs or things that maybe I just want to check out and you want to drop some trailers in that channel, I highly recommend it. But that's it for me today. So I'm going to close down things here, and we're going to take a short break as Lindsay gets spun up for the next block of convention paneling and whatnot. I believe we've got some cosplay stuff coming up next. That should be fun. A little bit of changing gears from all the video game talk you guys have been seeing for the last couple of hours. So definitely enjoy that. I will, of course, be back in the chat later on today or so to join you guys all for the masquerade. And after the masquerade, maybe some drinking, maybe some dancing, whatever. I hear that Con is got some stuff planned in the evening tonight involving drinks and dancing and whatnot, so I'm going to be sure to check that stuff out as well. But that's it for me, like I said, so everybody enjoy the rest of Con G. My name's been Dan the Video Ninja, and I will probably see most of you in the Discord and the chat in the coming little while. So take it away, Lindsay. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy.